My name is Virginia Hall, and I'm here today to introduce you to Roger Rule, author of The Rifleman's Rifle and host of this series of episodes, Special Guns with Roger Rule.
Thank you, Virginia, and welcome viewers to my 20th episode of Special Guns with Roger Rule.
So what do we have today?
Today we have two custom-made rifles. While we have been covering special guns that have an evolutionary and revolutionary role in the development of the industry, we would be remiss in not addressing the custom gun makers and the part they've played in gun manufacture. It would be impossible to cover a detailed history of the custom rifle in one of these episodes, but I'll make an attempt to give a brief overview. Before mass production, with its interchangeable parts and the assembly line, guns were basically all custom made, or at least made individually one at a time. With the advent of Eli Whitney's system for making interchangeable parts, gun making changed. And adding to that, the introduction of the self-contained cartridge, followed by the manufacture of the repeating rifle, pretty much caused the art of the handmade individual gun to be relegated to companies specializing in that work, mostly in Great Britain and Western Europe. Here in America, 19th century riflemen were fascinated with the newness of the repeating rifles, and the first successful ones were lever actions, available in plain and fancy grades. And here at home, the custom-made rifle market just shriveled and nearly died.
This was in the 19th century?
Yes, but here's what changed it. Most of us who have followed guns know that World War I introduced riflemen to the bolt-action repeater, shooting Spitzer bullets safely and accurately. The riflemen coming home from Europe had become familiar with them. At the close of that war, the commercial gun makers had not pursued this interest, and the market was just flooded with inexpensive used military rifles. And these were quality Springfields, Enfields, and Mausers at very low prices.
These surplus military guns were lower priced than gun manufacturers could make?
Lower than any operating company could manufacture for profit at that time. American riflemen bought these secondhand guns, which continued on the market for such a length of time that a decade later, youngsters growing up with them also developed interest in the bolt action. That interest in general was here to stay. Gun writers in the outdoor press like Colonel Townsend Whelan endorsed sporterizing the military rifles during this time. Commercial makers saw this interest but were slow to respond.
The commercial makers still couldn't make them as inexpensive.
They couldn't make them as well without being much more costly. And for years, these surplus rifles continued to dominate sales, and since they were ugly guns to the sport-minded rifleman, it became commonplace to change the stocks. Articles in the outdoor press continued to support this. Small companies sprang up to answer the need. The best makers wanted their customers' military rifles sent to them for fitting the stocks, and most of those began working on metal features as well, eliminating the military clip slots, modifying the magazine faller to not block the bolt when it was empty, changing the safety to operate with a mounted telescope, replacing military two-stage trigger, among others. For a few years, these makers had a corner on the market, and while the custom makers flourished to outdo each other, they kept improving and getting better and better.
Do we know who these custom makers were?
By the 20s and 30s, companies like Griffin and Hale of New York, Hoffman Arms of Cleveland, R.F. Sedgley of Philadelphia, and Nieder Arms of Dowagiac, Michigan, were all competing in this market using the actions from Springfields, Mausers, and Enfields. The better makers were replacing the military barrels and reworking and honing the actions. Many of these became so diligent that actions, after inspection, might be annealed, ground to remove markings and unnecessary lumps and bumps, and then reheat treated and proof tested. These were the early makers, and they turned out some beautiful work converting military rifles, or at least using the actions, into well-built, high-grade sporting rifles. Engraving and gold inlays became symbols of the highest order. Besides these companies, independent craftsmen got into the act and developed reputations for their own work. Some of the better ones remembered are R.G. Owen, Alvin Linden, August Packmeyer, Fred Adolph, and Adolph Miner, most of which started in the custom stock trade. Then, in 1941, here in the U.S., World War II interrupted the sporting rifle manufacture. But as the Second War ended by 1945, surplus rifles were once again available, and with the outdoor press increasing their attention toward custom makers, that industry resumed. Writers like Warren Page of Field and Stream, Jack O'Connor of Outdoor Life, Pete Brown of Sports Afield, and John T. Amber, the editor of Gun Digest, all sang high praises for the work of the independent craftsmen. And a new group emerged. Dale Goens, Al Beeson, Lynn Brownell, Monty Kennedy, Hal Hartley, Leonard Muse, the Bartlett brothers, Keith Stegall, and others. Today, the story continues. The gun writers are still at it, and the list of great makers is incredible. I would recommend you get copies of both editions of Modern Custom Guns by Tom Turpin to follow the current custom makers and the specialists such as stockers, metalsmiths, checkers, barrel makers, carvers, engravers, and inlay craftsmen. The custom maker today is basically an independent craftsman that uses outsourced actions. They rework the actions and build every part by hand, creating a handmade gun, and if they are very good at their craft, the final product is much better than any mass-produced gun. The best ones are a work of art, sometimes with fancy checkering and engraving, but even without those features, the overall design, the wood-to-metal fit, and every aspect is meticulously crafted. The current American custom rifle has reached the pinnacle of the gun-making art. When I look at the history, I divide the renaissance of the bolt-action custom rifle into three periods. Period 1 consists of those following World War I up to World War II. Period 2 includes those that began after World War II and comprises that generation of makers in that period that are all now deceased. Period 3 in my list of categories includes the current makers still alive, which we refer to as the custom makers of today. For the most part, with each period, the level of work improved.
So we're looking at 2 rifles today.
Yes, today I have 2 rifles of makers from periods 1 and 2, one representing a custom maker firm and the other representing a custom maker independent. The first one from period 1 is representative of one of the first truly custom maker companies in the United States, still going strong, Griffin and Hale of New York. The other rifle from period 2 is representative of a deceased independent maker, the late Dale Goens of Cedar Crest, New Mexico. Since most custom makers do not make their own actions, the basis for their rifles comes from the action they use. The 3 most common actions used during period 1 were the 1898 Mauser, the 1903 Springfield, and the 1917 Enfield, the latter mostly used for oversized cartridges. By the time period 2 came along, use of the Enfield action diminished, and another one, a fourth one, became popular to use the Winchester Pre-64 Model 70 action. This one was also available to those makers of period 1 who were still operating during period 2. Custom rifles made with the Winchester Pre-64 Model 70 action seem to be the most cherished, my bias aside, if one just compares prices. The two rifles I have here today are both based on the Winchester Pre-64 Model 70 action. This will help in keeping the descriptions of these rifles from being too long and involved, since I've already covered the details of this great action in episode 1 of the Special Gun series. For an understanding of how the Pre-64 Model 70 Winchester action differed from the 1903 Springfield and the Mauser 98, I'd refer you to watch episode 1 again to see that explanation of the improvements. For our first gun here, when Seymour Griffin of Griffin and Hale began, his emphasis was just on changing the stock of a military rifle to take on the look of a sportsman's rifle. But as already stated, the competition among these stock makers grew to include the metalwork, and none reached the top of the heap higher in that regard than Griffin and Hale did.
What caliber is this one?
This Griffin Hale rifle is chambered in .338 Winchester Magnum. Here's a little history of Griffin and Hale. It was established in May of 1923, formed by 5 men. One of them was Seymour Griffin, the cabinet maker who had become a stock maker inspired earlier by President Theodore Roosevelt's complaint of the military stock on his 1903 Springfield rifle. Griffin had built stocks since 1910, 13 years preceding his meeting James V. Hale, an accomplished metalworker and foreman of the machine shop at Frankfurt Arsenal in Philadelphia. The two had been introduced to each other by the outdoor writer Colonel Townsend Whelan, who was the foremost authority on rifles at the time. So, in 1923, the two craftsmen combined their talents, one making stocks and the other refining metal, to build beautiful, custom-made rifles based on the 1903 Springfield, also Mauser 98s and other actions. That company operated out of New York and introduced its famous telescopic side mount in 1927, still renowned today. This scope mounting system was one of the first of its kind, making it possible to remove the scope and replace it without losing zero. Then in 1930, the firm was purchased by Abercrombie and Fitch. During World War II, the company had to discontinue its rifle business to fulfill making gun parts for the military, and some 23,000 of their telescopic side mounts were made for the Springfield Armory. A couple of decades later, by the 1960s, Griffin and Hale had become the gold standard of American custom rifle making, having provided rifles for Dwight D. Eisenhower, Clark Gable, Bing Crosby, and Ernest Hemingway, among others. In 1976, Abercrombie and Fitch sold the company to a longtime employee, Bill Ward, who has continued to keep the best artisans in staff building a limited number of America's finest custom rifles. With this long history, Griffin and Hale rifles made during Period 1, while fine rifles with some outstanding specimens had reached the high point of the art of custom gun making at that time. However, for the most part today, those from that period are not as advanced as some of their later rifles because of the improvements in telescopic sights and the introduction of the Winchester Pre-64 Model 70 action. Those first period guns are not as practical today as they were for their own period, but will always be valuable among collectors. Yet, because of Griffin and Hale's enduring longevity, the rifle we're going to review today was still made of the highest order and is as advanced for the hunting fields as any custom rifle made today. It was actually made in 1973, 3 years before Abercrombie and Fitch sold the New York company. In reviewing this Griffin and Hale rifle, let's look at its Winchester Pre-64 Model 70 action first. Based on its serial number, its Winchester serial number, the action was made in September of 1960.
So the rifle was made in 1973, but the action was made in 1960.
Yes, you have it. The rifle has 2 serial numbers, one for the action, in case of Winchester serial number, and one for the rifle as a whole, which is Griffin and Hale's serial number. This is a common practice for custom makers. It also has been a practice used by English rifle makers using outsourced actions for over 100 years.
I remember that from the Rigby rifle that we covered.
Good, and a couple of others we reviewed. So let's examine this rifle closely. First, let me check for safety. Open the bolt. I can see the chamber is empty. Let's examine the metal differences from the standard Pre-64 Model 70 action. These include a jeweled bolt, extractor, and magazine follower, although Winchester provided those as well on many of the super grades. An engraved bolt knob with 5 panels of checkering and 1 starburst at the end of the knob. The rear receiver tang is nicely contoured and rounded. Inside the action, the bolt has been honed and the action rails lapped, creating an operation that is very smooth. Continuing with the metalwork, the maker of this barrel is unknown, but it's a custom 24-inch barrel, round, tapered, with cut rifling. The barrel is fitted with 3 accessories. The first is the front sight, a bead dovetailed into a banded ramp. The ramp is finely cross-hatched and wears a removable sight protector hood with a knurled front quarter section for easy grasp, and it's still aesthetically pleasing. A second barrel accessory is the banded front sling swivel eye, and the third and last barrel accessory is the famous Griffin and Hale quarter ramp holding the rear sights. These comprise 3 folding leaves inscribed 100 yards, 200 yards, 300 yards with inlaid gold vertical sighting lines. The front of the quarter ramp is nicely sculptured with an artistic transition to the barrel, and the top of the ramp is stippled evenly in 3 sections with borders around each section. The barrel is inscribed number 2488 Griffin and Hale, New York, New York. If we set the rifle on its side like this, you can see the floor plate and the trigger guard are Winchester, but the trigger face is checkered and the 2 action screws are indexed. And also from this orientation, you can see 3 more metal parts that remain to be mentioned. A coved edge steel pistol grip cap with an engraved center screw, an inlaid gold oval for the owner's initials. This one is vacant, and a blued rear sling swivel eye located between the oval and the toe of the stock. All parts except the jeweled bolt and extractor and magazine follower are finished with a rust blue and a polished and deep rich blue finish. Examining the stock, it's a classic Griffin and Hale configuration with as fancy a figure as can be had with a powerful cartridge, maintaining critical balance between attractiveness and strength of wood. This is a rare and very hard to find piece of beautiful English walnut with great color and contrast of black and brown tones, with the figure planned in the right locations. The straightest grain is in the most stressful parts, and the fanciest grain is in the least stressful areas. Notice the shape of the cheek piece. It is on the left side for the right-handed shooter, and it has very well sculptured shadow line. A Griffin and Hale hallmark for period 2 rifles is that the cheek piece shape starts at the left top of the comb and continues from there around forming the cheek piece. For the right side of the stock, the comb is fluted. The forend is fitted with genuine Macassar ebony tip. The forearm checkering is full wraparound with 8 points, 4 on each side and both ends. It has a combination of double and single borders. The checkering on the grip is one continuous panel wrapped around, fully checkered to meet the pistol grip cap and designed with 5 upper points, 2 on each side, and 1 over the wrist pointing back to the comb. It also has a combination of single and double borders on the grip checkering. There's also a nice even margin around the rear receiver tang of uncheckered wood. All diamonds on both the grip and the forearm are 22 lines per inch. None are missing or mashed down. And there are no runovers or errors. This checkering is executed in the highest degree of precision. The wood to metal fits perfect, as one would expect from Griffin and Hale, and the wood is finished with their renowned oil finish, hand rubbed with many coats. Stock accessories include not only the metal parts already mentioned, but this butt pad, which is a 1-inch thick black decelerator pad. The length to pull matches the original Model 70 at 13.5 inches. The weight of the rifle is 8 pounds without a scope, and 8 pounds 13 ounces with the scope. The proper weight for the recoil generated by the .338 Magnum caliber. The scope is mounted with a Griffin and Hale removable side mount. Notice the side mount is attached with no screws, blind screws. The scope is an Austrian made Swarovski 3-9 by 36, which I think is the perfect scope size for this gun and this caliber, the type of hunting it was intended. I'll demonstrate the famous Griffin and Hale detachable release scope levers. Just on the front one, turn this way. Front one you turn up and forward. The back one you pull up and turn all the way flat rearward. And that, when they're both down and horizontal, the scope just slides off. Has a dovetailed base and 2 dimples here to catch the bolts. To reverse it, just slide it back on. Let's see what they're doing here. And then pull it all the way till it locks. And George Caswell of Champlain Arms once told me these scope mounts work great if you tighten the levers back in reverse order of how you loosened them. So we loosened the front one first, we'll tighten it back with the back one, then the front one. Okay, we're getting ready to do test on the 200 yards on my Griffin and Hale 338. And this is the target. I'm getting ready to put it out there. This is the Griffin and Hale 338. We're going to test it on the 200 range. It's already sighted in. I want to see how verify on the elevation. I'm shooting hand loads of 71.5 grains of IM 4350 with a Nosler 210 partition bullet. I'm going to fire 3 or 4 rounds, whatever it takes to make me feel comfortable that we have it sighted in at 200 yards. Oh, that's good enough. Great. Okay, this is the Griffin and Hale target. You can see the shots were enough to let me know it's pretty close to right on the X, about 1 inch high. If I were to adjust it at all, it'd be just a one click for 1/2 inch, probably at 200 yards. So overall, the condition of this rifle would appear that it's not been shot since it left New York, as there's absolutely no wear.
It looks like a brand new gun.
And it shoots well. It holds groups as tight as any man can shoot with a sporter rifle, 1/2 MOA. We have a video clip of me sighting it in at 200 yards. I have a target here. Here's the target with the 2 shots that were enough verification that it was sighted in. I discovered the right load for this rifle at 71.0 grains of IMR 4350 powder with Winchester silver tip 250 grain bullets. As you can see, it's quite accurate from just these 2 shots. I didn't want to shoot a third one. I might mess the group up. So to summarize this rifle, this is a premier sporting rifle with professional touch by the firm of Griffin and Hale, set up with what has been a best workable scope mounting system since 1927 and still is today. This rifle is a perfect example, now becoming scarce, of a modern Griffin and Hale made rifle in the heyday of when Griffin and Hale was still owned by Abercrombie and Fitch.
And what's the second rifle that we have today?
The second custom-made rifle we have today comes from my second period following World War II. While Griffin and Hale represents one of the best firms of custom rifle makers that started in period 1, our next gun is an example of one of the premier independent custom rifle makers that started in period 2. This gun was made in 1982, and per my definition for period 2 makers, the artist is deceased. His name was Dale Wesley Goens. Because Mr. Goens used a Winchester P64 Model 70 action on this rifle, and because it is fitted with a modern telescopic sight, its age has not displaced it to collectors-only status. It remains appropriate for the hunting fields today. This independent maker was one of the finest of period 2. Mr. Goens lived from September 8, 1916 to July 18, 2005. He was born in Plainville in Brooks County, Kansas. His childhood family moved to Horton, Kansas, where he attended Horton High School, taking woodshop and lettering and football and track. In his early adult years, he played guitar and sang professionally in dance halls and on radio. When World War II broke out, he attended the North American Aviation Aeronautical School in Kansas City, and after graduation went to work in North America's Kansas City, Kansas plant building B-25 aircraft. After the war, the plant shut down and he acquired a job in a music store in Enid, Oklahoma, teaching guitar. It was there that he built his first guitar. In the spring of 1949, he received an offer to work at Sandia Base in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Married with children, his family then moved to Cedar Crest in August. He worked at the base for 22 years. However, during that time, with his love of woodworking and his interest in hunting big game in New Mexico, he began a sideline business of making gun stocks for hunting rifles. His gun business grew to such a point that to pursue it full-time, he needed to take an early retirement from his day job at the base. This was in October of 1971. His stock work soon grew to include limited metal smithing as well, and he became an early member of the American Custom Gunmakers Guild. Eventually, he received national and international fame and was renowned for his checkering patterns and his skill at checkering. He continued making custom rifles until November 2000, when he fully retired and stopped his custom work. Tragically, he died 5 years later from prostate cancer. Let's take a look at this gun I have here today, built by Mr. Goens. I'll be handling it, so I'm going to check it for safety. Opening the bolt, you can see the chamber is empty. Like our Griffin and Hale rifle just reviewed, this one also has a Winchester P64 Model 70 action. The action was made in 1952 based on its serial number, Winchester serial number. But Mr. Goens built the rifle in 1982, 30 years later. It's chambered in my favorite caliber, .270 Winchester. And let's look at the several metal differences from the standard pre-64 Model 70 action that Goens improved here. Probably the most noticeable is the prominent bolt handle. It's only slightly angled, more than a Mauser, but much less than a Winchester Model 70. It also is longer, and it protrudes from the stock more than usual. And my attention is drawn to the bolt knob, which has two generous panels of checkered steel. Examining the action closer, we can see other visible changes from the factory action. The maker has reshaped the receiver tang to look similar to the factory tang on a Winchester Model 70 Type 1 and Type 2 receivers, that more commonly called pre-war and transition guns. The bolt and the magazine follower are jeweled or engine turned, but the extractor is not. Unseen to the viewer is the fact that Goens honed the bolt and lapped the rails, making the action extremely smooth. The trigger is factory, but it's honed to a crisp let-off at 2 pounds. The barrel's an early Krieger barrel. They started in 1982, and it is tapered and round at 22.5 inch. It has cut rifling, and it's known for accuracy. The barrel has no attachments, yet it is not free-floated, but mated to the stock perfectly, as are all Goens barrels. It is inscribed on top, Dale W. Goens, number 1141 in script, not blued. Here again, we find the common practice of these custom makers having two serial numbers, one for the manufacturer's action and one for the maker's rifle number. All parts, except the jeweled bolt magazine follower, are finished in the rust blue and a polished and soft, rich, deep rust blue finish. Looking at the stock, this is another scarce piece of beautiful English walnut with warm brown color and contrasting black, nearly parallel streaks. Besides the streaks, there's some fiddleback. Again, the grain of the wood gives away that the figure is planned in the right locations for best beauty and maximum strength. The stockwork is classic Goens in shape, quality fit, and the popular Goens style with the fleur-de-lis checkering. Let's turn the rifle around so that the left profile shows to the camera. From this view, you can see the maker built up and checkered the bolt stop release, a feature found only on the finest custom rifles. And like the Griffin and Hale stock, the rifle was built with cheek piece on the left side for the right-handed shooter. It also has a very well sculptured shadow line or bead. And unlike the Griffin and Hale cheek piece, this one does not start from the comb, but rather begins on the pistol grip about 1 inch below the comb. This allows the comb to be fluted on both sides, unlike the Griffin and Hale rifle. And like that rifle, the forearm is fitted with the genuine Macassar ebony tip. The checkering is the famous Dale Goens fleur-de-lis pattern. For the forearm, the rounded checkering pattern fully wraps around with 3 carved fleur-de-lis and 2 masterfully cut ribbons running through the panels, a feature which is extremely tedious to execute. Panels have single borders. On the grip, the checkering is separated into 3 panels. It gives the impression that it wraps around. One small panel is over the wrist, and 2 separate panels are on the right and left sides. These side panels are generous, starting from the receiver and going fully to the pistol grip cap, with fancy single borders and 1 large fleur-de-lis carved on each side. These are placed best for looks and planned so that they least interrupt the hold on the grip. This allows the checkered diamonds to maximize the area where their purpose is intended. The diamonds are small at 24 lines per inch. And like the Griffin and Hale rifle before, The checkering here is perfect with no runovers, flawlessly cut. The wood to metal fit couldn't be better, and Mr. Goens finished the stock with a satin French polish oil finish that highlights the grain and figure of the wood. If we were to set the rifle so that you can see the underside, we can see the stock accessories include the front and rear sling swivels. They're inlaid and tied down with 2 screws. Also, there's a coved pistol grip cap, steel one, and a Beeson checkered steel butt plate curved to fit the shoulder with an inlaid widow's peak. That's what that's called. I have not addressed the most prominent feature of all, the incredible engraving on the bottom metal. The floor plate and trigger guard are Winchester, but as you can see, they are ornately engraved. When the rifle is stored upright in the gun cabinet, the robust foliate scroll by Mitch Machete makes it stand out. Mr. Machete has heavily engraved the undermetal, including the floor plate hinge, the floor plate, the trigger guard, and the pistol grip cap, all with the design of deep chased arabesque leaves and scrolls. The pistol grip cap also has 2 time screws, and they're engraved. The length of pull of this rifle is 13 5/8 inch to the center of the curved Beeson butt plate. And without the scope, the rifle weighs 7 pounds 14 ounces, and with scope, 8 pounds 7 ounces. The scope is an Austrian Swarovski 3-10 by 42, mounted in fixed tally rings. A good light gathering scope for early morning and evening stalking of medium big game, for which this gun was meant to be used. Let me set the rifle down. This is the second gun. It's a Dale Goens custom-made 270, and I'll check it for safety. There is a shell in it. Going to be shooting target at 200 yards. This gun has already been sighted in, and I want to find out if how it matches it. It was sighted in at 50 and 100 for 200. I'm using a Winchester PowerPoint 270 caliber 130 grain bullets. I'll shoot as many as it takes to verify the distance is correct. Check those two and see if they're close enough. I think they're a pretty good shot. Yes, good. That's enough. Okay, this is the target I retrieved from 200 yards, and you can see there's no need to shoot another bullet. It's right on at 200 yards. This I'm going to remember this ammunition for this rifle.
Up close, this Goens rifle looks absolutely new.
Its condition would appear that it has not been shot since it left Cedar Crest, New Mexico. But like the Griffin and Hale rifle we just looked at, I took this one to the range and sighted in for 200 yards using my pet load of 55.5 grains of IMR 4350 powder and 130 grain Winchester PowerPoints in that case, and discovered this rifle is amazingly accurate as well. We have some video clips here at the range shooting the verification shots, and I also have the target here. Again, 2 shots told me what I wanted to know, and I didn't want to spoil the group with the 3rd shot. In summary, this is another premier sporting rifle custom made by one of the great custom makers of period 2 of the independent gun makers in the second half of the last century. With no more Dale Goens rifles being made, this example in such pristine condition, if it's kept this way, it will become quite rare with attrition. Yet I don't endorse keeping it just in a safe queen. This rifle was made to take its place in the hunting fields, and I, for one, would use it for that purpose.
It's too nice.
That's it for today. Thank you, Virginia, and thank you, viewers, for watching. And if you enjoyed this episode, I invite you to subscribe to my YouTube channel and share with others. And I hope you join us next episode for a rundown on a popular shotgun. If you want to get involved with these types of guns, I recommend GunsInternational.com. The owners are great people. I know them and have been using their website since they started. I find it the best source for both buying and selling any great collectible gun.